This is Shalom World Podcast.
Welcome to Voyage. I am your host, Francis Hogan. Welcome to our sharing on the second half of St. John's Gospel. We are now in chapter 19, and we're coming to deal with the execution of the King of the Jews, the Messianic Davidic King. And so I want to read a few verses for you, and this is from verse 17. Then they took charge of Jesus, they are the Roman soldiers, and carrying his own cross, he went out of the city to the place of the skull called Golgotha. There they crucified him with two others, one on the right and one on the left, with Jesus in the middle. Pilate wrote out a notice and had it fixed to the cross. It ran, "Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews." This notice was read by many of the Jews because the place where Jesus was crucified was not very far from the city. And the writing was in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, the three main languages of the day. So the Jewish chief priest said to Pilate, "You shouldn't write King of the Jews, but this man said, 'I am the King of the Jews.'" Pilate answered, "Quod scripsi, scripsi." What I have written, I have written. He said it in Latin, his own language. So we need to come and look at this great mystery that is given to us here. And the first thing I want to point out, of course, is that John deals with the whole subject very differently to that of the synoptic gospels. If you go back to the synoptic gospels, there's an awful lot of noise and accusations and insults thrown at Jesus while he's actually dying. This is not so in John's gospel. John is writing this text 60 years after Christianity has come into existence. So what he wants to do is give you the whole mystery in different scenes, separate scenes, one after the other. And he wants you to contemplate each one. And so he has put a sense of silence and awe into the whole thing. And so he doesn't allow the insults or the terrible noise that would have been there in the actual event. He wants you to see that Jesus is very silent, very controlled, very loving. He never changes who he is. And it's just the sheer heroism that you're looking at. Even if you don't look at it even more deeply, it's just absolutely amazing. John wants you to know, of course, that this is not happening to Jesus in the sense of him being a helpless victim. That is not so. John has told us from the beginning that Jesus is really in charge of these events. For example, back in the supper room in chapter 13, verse 27, he gave permission to his betrayer to go and do whatever he was going to do. In chapter 18, we saw him control his own arrest. He wouldn't surrender until his disciples were free and the people arresting him actually knew who he was. When you look at the trial under Pilate, it actually turned out to be a proclamation of his kingship. And now we're going to see him carrying his own cross like a royal banner. And he will be enthroned on the altar of the cross. And it is his royal enthronement. And John wants you to hear that this is the lifting up of the Son of Man that you've been talked about right from the very beginning of the Gospel of John. And John wants you to remember back in Genesis chapter 22, when Isaac was walking to Mount Moriah with his father Abraham, that Isaac carried the wood of the sacrifice on his shoulders. And here John emphasizes that Jesus carries the wood of the cross on his shoulders. That means that he is cooperating with what is happening, because for him, he is doing this out of absolute 100% obedience to his Father and love for his beloved disciples and all who will believe in him. So John keeps on emphasizing that Jesus is the victim sacrifice for sin and that he is expressing love that has no limits. It's really amazing. John does acknowledge that Jesus died between two malefactors, but he doesn't give you the details that you will find in Luke's gospel. I just want to remind you of something I brought out in the supper room as well, and that is that Jesus dies between the two types of children that you find on the earth. Those who cooperate with the Lord and those who rebel. Those who open up, as the so-called good thief opened up to the grace of Jesus, and those who close themselves off like Judas and the other thief in this mysterious closing of the heart to God, because human beings have free will. So that mystery goes right up to the last moment of Jesus' life. But also the two types of children are in the crowd in front of Jesus as well, because in the crowd there are friends and foes. There are those who believe and those who absolutely reject him. And so that is there all the time. John emphasizes the fact that Pilate is very, very anxious to make this look as if it was a legal event. And so he himself personally wrote out the statement that would have to be put over the cross of Jesus to announce what is going on. And he announced that Jesus of Nazareth is the King of the Jews. And not only that, but he wrote it in the three main languages of the Roman Empire: Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. This means that it is a universal proclamation. Now, Pilate, as a pagan and an unbeliever and someone absolutely lost in the cosmos, the unbelieving world, would have no idea that God was using him because of his position to actually make the world realize that what was going on here is actually a cosmic event. It is not just a man dying on a cross. And this proclamation actually does that. The Sanhedrin, of course, object because they tried to get Pilate to accept that Jesus was a pretender king. So you can't actually make the proclamation that he is a real king. But of course, Pilate has a great need to get back at the Sanhedrin as well. And so the proclamation is there. Now, Pilate doesn't understand part of the proclamation that he has made. Here is the last king of dynasty of David dying on a cross. This means that the dynasty of David is over. It's finished. There will be no more kings of David's line. Jesus was the only living person in Israel who could do that. But John wants you to think of something else, because Jesus is leaving the human dynasty of David to pick up his eternal kingship. And so I just want to remind you again, for the last time in this gospel, about Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. This time I'll read it for you, because the human Davidic king is dying. The dynasty is over, but the eternal kingship of Christ has begun. I gazed into the visions of the night, and I saw coming on the clouds of heaven one like a son of man. And of course, that was the identity that Jesus gave himself. He came to the one of great age, that is God the Father, and was led into his presence. This is shown very clearly in chapter 4 and 5 of the book of Revelation. And on him was conferred sovereignty, glory, and kingship. Nothing to do with any human stuff or any ephemeral stuff or anything that would pass away. This is eternal. On him was conferred sovereignty, glory, and kingship, and men of all peoples, nations, and languages became his servants. Because we're going to see, as soon as we go into chapter 20, a completely new era has begun, and Jesus is going to be worshipped and believed and praised and served by people from all over the world. It is, in fact, a cosmic event. His sovereignty is an eternal sovereignty which will never pass away. nor will his empire ever be destroyed. That's very interesting in the context that I'm actually using it in, because the Roman Empire was destroyed. And all the other empires that Daniel spoke about, they all came and went. But Jesus' empire lasts forever. And when we go through the drama of the book of Revelation, we see him coming back as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. But now we see him being pinned to a cross. And as far as Jesus is concerned, this is the only throne he's going to get on the earth. But we have to remember John chapter 3, verses 14 to 16. When I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men to myself. Hence the emphasis on the cosmic event is actually very, very important. Okay, so let's read 2 more verses for you. When the soldiers had finished crucifying Jesus, they took his clothing and divided it into 4 shares, 1 for each soldier. So there's 4 men in charge of killing this man. His undergarment was seamless, woven in one piece from neck to hem, of course made by his mother. So they said to one another, instead of tearing it, let's throw dice to decide who will have it. And in this way the words of Scripture were fulfilled. They shared out my clothing among them, and they cast lots for my clothes. This is exactly what the soldiers did. When we come, as I said, in John's Gospel to Golgotha, everything is given to us in silence, but given to us in bite sizes. He gives us one thing and then another, one after the other, wanting you to look at it separately from all the rest, so that you would actually enter much more deeply into the reality. So by the time we have arrived here, all the noise of the praetorium and the flurry and all the rest of it is all over. Now we have Jesus stripped a second and final time, because when men were crucified, they were crucified naked, and they were meant to hang there with every dignity removed from them. It was meant to be the total and absolute humiliation of a human being. And I will show you more about this further on. I only want to say it as John says it. As they were stripping Jesus, they found that his undergarment was seamless. Now, that's not the way that people actually made garments in those days. The seamless garment was worn by the high priest. It was part of his consecration. And so what John wants you to look at is that as they strip Jesus, they discover he's dressed as the high priest. So this is the reminder that this is much greater than you think, that this is the sacrifice, and Jesus is the priest, and this is his altar, and this is the first Mass. It is absolutely amazing. Now, it was customary to share out the prisoners' clothing with the soldiers who were actually killing them. And it must have been an awful thing for a dying man to look down and realize he didn't even have clothes. He has nothing, absolutely nothing. Everything is taken away. So Psalm 22, verse 18 said, they have divided my garments among them and cast lots for my clothes. And you'd wonder why the psalm said, they will cast lots for my clothes. So John explains it. It's because Jesus is wearing the high priestly garment. And therefore John wants us to remember that what Jesus said in his priestly prayer in chapter 17, verse 19, that he was consecrating himself as a victim for the sake of his disciples and for the sake of the church. And this was going to be the way that he would release all the captives of Satan, which Isaiah speaks about in chapter 61, verses 1 to 4. After this, then, we come to another very interesting incident, which is only mentioned by John and is not mentioned in the synoptic gospels, and that is the conversation, brief but very deep, between Jesus and his mother. So this is verse 25. Near the cross stood his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary of Magdala. And seeing his mother, That means concentrating upon her as distinct from the other women. And seeing the disciple that he loved near her, because John was standing there protecting Jesus' mother and consoling her and trying to help her. Jesus said to his mother, "Woman, this is your son." And then to the disciple he said, "This is your mother." And from that moment, the disciple made a place for her in his home. Now, this is a much bigger event than just the few words would actually indicate. The scholars have great fun with the statement as to who these women actually are. Depending on how you translate it, there are either 3 women at the foot of the cross or 4. I'm just going to accept that there was 3. You have Mary, the mother of Jesus. Unfortunately, they're all called Mary. You have Mary, the mother of Jesus, the faithful co-redeemer in this great event. And you have Mary, the wife of Clopas, who was a sister-in-law of Jesus' mother. She was a lifelong friend of Jesus' mother, and she was her mainstay and support through everything. This Mary, the wife of Clopas. And yet, almost nothing is said of her in the Gospels. And the other person is Mary of Magdala, the great symbol of spiritual resurrection. You only have to look at Mary of Magdala to see what is on offer to all other sinners for all time. And so you have Jesus' mother, you have her faithful friend and sister-in-law, and you have the symbol of resurrection, which is actually terribly important. So these women are with Jesus. Remember when we went back to the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin, that Peter was with Jesus, but not with him in the right way. He was merely present. Now, these women are with Jesus actually in the mystery, which is a different subject altogether. These women are not only with him in the mystery, but they form the first adorers of the Lamb at the foot of the cross. They're the first adoration group. They're the ones who represent all people who gather around the cross of Christ or the Eucharist to adore the Lamb of God. These women witness everything. They witness his crucifixion, they witness his death, they witness his burial, and they witness his resurrection. And so these women are extremely important in the gospel narrative and in the witness of the church. They stand in total contrast to the Roman soldiers and the chief priests and all the others who are simply oozing hatred and rejection and violence and scorn at Jesus. When we look at the words of Jesus to his mother, "Woman, behold your son," we have to look at that on 2 different levels. I don't mean the level of below and the level of above. I mean from a family standpoint and from a church standpoint. From a family standpoint, we have very important evidence given to us here. Because Jesus was an only child, there was no brothers and sisters. It was his duty before he died to take care of his mother, because he was living in a society where widows and orphans had no help. And so it was absolutely essential for Jesus to hand his mother over to the care of someone who would really take care of her. Now, if Jesus had brothers and sisters, it would be inexplicable that he would hand his mother over to somebody who was not in the family. It would be absolutely inexplicable. And so this is one of the great proofs that people don't see that Jesus did not have siblings. The other level that we have to look at is that Jesus' mother represents the church in this incident. Well, she represents the church anyway. And John actually represents the church. Both of them represent the church. And so Jesus is saying to his mother, "I'm giving my church to you. There's your son." And he's saying to John, I am giving you a mother. You actually need to be taken care of. She will take care of you, young church, baby church, in the same way as she took care of me when I was an infant and growing up. And so the function of Mary in the church is actually seen quite clearly. Now, we know from the tradition of the early church that John did in fact take Mary to his home, and he took care of her up to the time that she departed the earth in her Assumption. He did take care of her, and he did take her to Ephesus. And John was in charge of the church in Ephesus, and during that time she actually lived in the same place as John, so he took care of her. But there's something else as well, and that is that the church, represented by John, is told to take Blessed Mother on board, that the church for all time was going to need the mothering that our Blessed Mother would give them. They needed her guidance, they needed her help, and we need it very badly right now. Thank you for listening. Slán agus beannacht dé live. Goodbye. God bless you.
Thank you for joining us today. We'd like to hear what you thought of today's session. Share your feedback with us at podcast@shalomworld.org. You can motivate and support us today. shalomworld.org/donate. Visit shalomworld.org for more information about Shalom World podcasts. To get the latest updates, make sure you follow us on Instagram at Shalom World Podcasts. Shalom World Podcasts is now available on all online platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and others.